How do you feed 1 million people? How do you keep them clean, entertained, and under control, without electricity, without the internet, without modern engineering? Rome figured it out. And nobody came close for 1,500 years. The next European city to even reach 1 million people was London, and that wasn't until 1800 AD. But here's what makes Rome truly remarkable. This wasn't just a city of marble temples and triumphal arches. 3 streets away from the emperor's palace, people were hurling garbage out of windows onto anyone unlucky enough to be walking below. Senators and slaves, marble and mud, spectacle and squalor, all crammed into the same 7 hills. I used cutting-edge AI technology to reconstruct ancient Rome at the height of its power, all grounded in historical records and archaeological evidence. We're going to get up close, walk through specific buildings, and get a real sense of what it actually felt like to be there. The glory and the grit. If you're new here, this is Andrew Restores History. We bring the ancient world back to life using AI. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. 70 million people, 3 continents, 1 empire. All of it controlled from a single city. And this is what it looked like. At the center of it all, the Roman Forum. This was the nerve center of the most powerful empire the ancient world had ever produced. Dozens of temples, monuments, and public buildings packed into a single plaza. But a few specific spots stand out, places where the course of history actually changed. This is the Curia, the Senate House. 600 senators gathered within these walls to debate the laws that governed half the known world. Remarkably, the building still stands today, one of the best preserved structures in the entire forum. Out in the open plaza stands the rostra, the speaker's platform. This is where Mark Antony delivered his legendary eulogy after Julius Caesar's assassination. We don't have his exact words, but ancient accounts tell us he raised Caesar's blood-soaked toga above the crowd and read the will aloud, revealing that Caesar had left money and public gardens to every citizen of Rome. The speech ignited the crowd so completely that they cremated Caesar's body right here on this very spot. Romans later built the temple of Julius Caesar on that exact ground, making him the first mortal in Roman history to be officially declared a god. But the most sacred site in the entire forum wasn't a temple to any emperor. It was this small, circular structure, the Temple of Vesta. Inside, a flame burned without interruption for over 1,000 years, kept alive by the Vestal Virgins. Romans believed with absolute certainty that if that flame ever died, the empire would fall with it. These women committed 30 years of their lives to this duty and were bound to celibacy. Breaking that vow carried the ultimate punishment, being buried alive. Yet, in return, they held privileges no other Roman woman could access: the right to own property, the power to pardon condemned prisoners, and a social standing that even senators had to respect. The tradition survived until 394 AD, when Christianity brought it to an end. The Senate, the eternal flame, the speaker's platform, and we've barely scratched the surface of what stood here. This single plaza was the beating heart of the most powerful empire on Earth. Just above the forum, overlooking everything, sat Palatine Hill. The emperors didn't just live here, they consumed it. The entire hill became one vast sprawling palace complex that grew more extravagant with every generation. The Domus Augusti was where it all began, the residence of Augustus, Rome's first emperor. By later standards, it was understated, almost modest. But this was the house that set the template for what imperial power looked like. Then came Emperor Domitian, who had no interest in modesty. He constructed the Domus Flavia, a ceremonial palace on a scale designed to overwhelm anyone who entered. Throne rooms with ceilings 30 meters high. Banquet halls that could seat hundreds of guests at once. Foreign kings and dignitaries received here left with no doubt about where the center of the world was. Right beside it stood the Domus Augustana, the emperor's private quarters, hidden from public view. Bedrooms, personal baths, gardens, intimate courtyards. 2 palaces side by side, one for performance, one for life. And then there was this. A private stadium, 160 meters long, built exclusively for the imperial family and their inner circle. The Circus Maximus, with its 150,000 seats, was literally within sight down the hill. Apparently, that wasn't enough. The emperor needed one of his own. But step away from the marble and the imperial grandeur, and you'd find a completely different city, the Subura. If Palatine Hill was Rome at its most powerful, the Subura was Rome at its most raw. Wedged between the Esquiline and Viminal hills, this district never slept, never quieted, and never pretended to be anything other than what it was: chaotic, dangerous, and alive in a way the Forum could never be. Narrow streets barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. Insulae, those 6-story apartment blocks, packed so tightly together that sunlight barely reached the ground. The smell alone would stop a modern visitor in their tracks. Open sewers, street food, unwashed bodies, and animals. This was where the poor lived, where criminals operated, where prostitutes worked out of ground-floor taverns, and where knife fights were settled quickly and quietly. The poet Juvenal described walking through the Subura at night as something close to a death wish. Even Julius Caesar, before he became Caesar, lived here as a young man, in a rented apartment, navigating these same streets. The wealthy Romans talked about the Subura the way they talked about everything inconvenient, with disdain and from a safe distance. But this district fed the city, clothed it, built it, and buried its dead. The empire ran on the backs of the people who lived here. This was the Rome that history books rarely show you. Now, while emperors watched races from private stadiums on the hill above, the real spectacle was happening down here. The Circus Maximus, the largest stadium the ancient world ever built. On race days, over 150,000 Romans packed every available inch to watch chariot racing, the most dangerous, most obsessive sport in the empire. Drivers reached speeds of 75 kilometers per hour, hurling around tight corners and deliberately ramming their competitors. Crashes were so catastrophic that Romans called them shipwrecks. Charioteers tied the reins around their waists, which meant that if they went down, they were dragged across the track until the horses stopped or they didn't survive. But survive long enough, and the rewards were extraordinary. One celebrated driver accumulated enough wealth over his career to feed the entire city of Rome for a full year. The fans were no less extreme. Romans divided themselves into 4 factions: blues, greens, reds, and whites, and the rivalries between them turned stadiums into battlegrounds. Riots broke out regularly. People died in the stands. This wasn't recreation, it was identity. The Circus Maximus held more people, but the Coliseum is what survived. Nearly 2,000 years later, it still stands. Smaller at 50,000 seats, but far more notorious. Because in the circus, death was a risk. In the Colosseum, death was the product. Over 3 centuries of operation, an estimated 400,000 people died on that arena floor. Gladiators, condemned criminals, prisoners of war, slaves. Animals were brought from every corner of the empire: lions from North Africa, bears from Germania, elephants from Egypt, and slaughtered by the thousands. Entire species were pushed toward extinction to fill the program. A standard day ran in sequence: executions at dawn, animal hunts through midday, gladiatorial combat in the afternoon. The crowd expected variety, and Rome delivered. What made all of it possible was hidden beneath the sand. A 2-story underground network, the Hypogeum, where slaves operated 28 wooden elevators connected by ropes and counterweights. An animal could be loaded into a cage below, hauled upward in darkness, and released through a trapdoor directly into the arena. To the audience above, it appeared from nowhere: pure theater, backed by brutal engineering. During the opening games alone, which ran for 100 consecutive days, 5,000 animals were killed. That pace continued for centuries. When Romans weren't watching people die, They were worshipping gods, and they built temples worthy of them. Most temples in Rome were dedicated to a single deity. The Pantheon was different. Its name says it plainly: Pantheon, all gods. Emperor Hadrian built it as a monument to every deity at once, a calculated act of comprehensive devotion. A note on this reconstruction. Some decorative details are educated interpretations. The original bronze fittings and ornamental elements were stripped away long ago, repurposed by later civilizations. What we know for certain is the structure itself, and it is extraordinary. The dome spans 43 meters across with no internal columns, no supporting framework of any kind. A single circular opening at the top, the oculus, lets in light and rain alike. Nearly 1,900 years after it was built, you can still walk inside and stand in exactly the same space Romans stood in. No other building from antiquity offers that. This design influenced every major domed structure that followed. Brunelleschi's Cathedral in Florence, the U.S. Capitol in Washington. The Pantheon survived because in 609 A.D., it was converted into a Christian church. That single decision saved it from the fate of almost every other Roman temple. But the Pantheon, for all its brilliance, was not Rome's most sacred building. That distinction belonged to the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, perched at the summit of Capitoline Hill, directly above the Forum. Built in 509 BC, it was Rome's oldest great temple. Dedicated to Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, the three pillars of Roman religion. This was where military triumphs ended. After conquering new territory, generals would lead their armies, their prisoners, and their plundered treasure up this hill to offer sacrifice to Jupiter. For over 800 years, it was the spiritual anchor of the empire. Unlike the Pantheon, it didn't survive. Fires destroyed it repeatedly. Today, almost nothing remains. Temples and gods gave Rome its spiritual authority, but the empire ran on military power. And no military force in Rome was more complex, more feared, or more politically dangerous than the Praetorian Guard. At their peak, around 10,000 soldiers strong, the Praetorians were the emperor's personal protection unit. They were paid 3 times the salary of a standard legionary. While every other Roman army was stationed at the edges of the empire, in Germania, in Syria, in Britain, the Praetorians lived here, inside Rome, at the Castra Praetoria. Roman law had for centuries forbidden armed troops within the city walls. Emperors broke that tradition for obvious reasons. They needed protection. What they didn't fully account for was what happens when the most powerful military force in the world is also the one standing closest to you. The Praetorian Guard assassinated at least 13 emperors. They toppled dynasties. On one occasion, following the murder of Emperor Pertinax in 193 AD, they literally auctioned off the imperial throne to the highest bidder. The Castra Praetoria's thick walls weren't built to keep enemies out. They were built to house the most politically volatile force in the empire. As for recognizing a Praetorian in the city, the ceremonial uniform made it unmistakable. The transverse red horsehair crest running side to side across the helmet, rather than front to back like standard legions, marked him immediately as elite. Silver scale armor, ornate shoulder plates, a red oval shield bearing the scorpion, the Praetorian symbol, alongside a decorated bronze belt and elaborately crafted sword scabbard. In reality, their appearance shifted with context. On campaign, they wore standard military gear. Patrolling the streets of Rome, many moved in civilian clothes. At state ceremonies, the full ceremonial display, the uniform served the moment. The danger was always constant. While emperors navigated their bodyguards, the city's million residents depended on something far less dramatic but equally essential: water. Rome built 11 major aqueducts. The Aqua Claudia was among the most impressive. Stretching 69 kilometers from mountain springs in the Anio Valley, it entered the city on stone arches rising 27 meters, roughly the height of a 9-story building. carrying water in a sealed channel along the top. Every day, ordinary Romans walked beneath these structures without a second thought, while above their heads, one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history quietly went about its work. The Aqua Claudia alone delivered enough fresh water to supply hundreds of thousands of people daily. No pumps, no electricity, pure gravity and precise gradient, calculated to move water across dozens of kilometers without losing pressure. Sections of these aqueducts are still standing today. When the sun went down over Rome, the city didn't quiet, it transformed. During daylight hours, wheeled vehicles were banned from the streets. The roads were simply too crowded, too narrow for carts and pedestrians to coexist. So, the moment darkness fell, the city erupted with the sound of wagon wheels on stone, merchants, delivery drivers, and traders moving goods through the night in a continuous, grinding roar that made sleep nearly impossible for anyone living near a main road. The poet Juvenal complained that a person could die of sleep deprivation in Rome before any disease got to them. Without street lighting, the city became genuinely dangerous after dark. The wealthy traveled with torch-bearing slaves. Everyone else moved quickly and hoped for the best. Thieves operated openly. The watch, the vigils, Rome's combination fire brigade and night patrol could not be everywhere, and the buildings themselves were a hazard. Residents of upper-floor Insulae, lacking any sanitation access, simply threw waste out of windows into the street below. Roman law technically forbade this, but enforcement was another matter entirely. Walking through Rome at night without looking up was a calculated risk. This was the city after hours, loud, dark, and ungoverned. So, where did the million people of Rome actually sleep? Around 90% of them lived in Insulae, multi-story apartment blocks rising 5 or 6 floors, built cheaply from wood and brick, and crammed together across every neighborhood in the city. A single room shared by an entire family was the standard. Noise, heat, and the smell of neighbors were constants. The higher your floor, the lower your rent, and the worse your conditions. No running water above the ground level, no kitchen. In winter, the upper floors were brutally cold. And if fire broke out, which it did regularly, you were navigating smoke-filled stairwells in the dark. Collapses were common enough that Augustus eventually passed laws capping the maximum height of Insulae at 20 meters. Later, emperors revised the limit downward still further. The buildings kept collapsing anyway. Every morning, residents poured out of those apartments and into the city, and one of the first places many of them headed was Trajan's Market. Built directly into the slope of Quirinal Hill, this was Rome's commercial center. Over 150 individual shops and offices spread across multiple levels, stacked in a structure that ancient Rome's closest equivalent to a modern shopping complex. On the ground floor, small open-fronted tabernae sold everything the city needed: spices shipped from the eastern provinces, fresh fish from the coast, wine, olive oil, bolts of cloth, ceramic vessels. The upper floors housed larger storage facilities and administrative offices, where contracts were drawn up, debts collected, and the logistics of supplying a million-person city were managed daily. Romans came here to buy, to sell, to negotiate, and to argue. The economy of an empire, concentrated in one hillside building. Most Romans didn't cook at home. The Insulae were fire traps. Open flames in a wooden building packed with families was a disaster waiting to happen, and everyone knew it. So the city developed something else: the Thermopolium. These were Rome's street food counters, and they were everywhere. A typical Thermopolium had a stone counter built into the street frontage, with large ceramic vessels, dolia, sunk into the surface and filled with hot food. Lentil stew, spiced wine, olives, bread, sausages, chickpeas. You paid a small coin, you ate standing at the counter or took it with you. Archaeologists have found hundreds of Thermopolia preserved in Pompeii alone, complete with traces of the food still inside the vessels. One counter had evidence of duck, pig, fish, snails, and beef, all being served simultaneously. For those with a little more money, there were proper taverns, koponai, where you could sit, eat a hot meal, drink wine, and get into an argument with a stranger about chariot racing. These places were loud, often disreputable, and absolutely central to daily Roman life. Respectable Romans pretended they never went. Most of them went anyway. The elite had their own food culture, elaborate dinner parties called convivia that could stretch for hours, with dozens of courses, entertainment, and philosophical conversation. But for the 90% living in the Insulae, Rome ran on street food. After the market and the tavern, there was one more place every Roman wanted to be before the day ended: the public baths. The baths of Trajan covered more than 11 hectares and could accommodate thousands of visitors simultaneously. Bathing in Rome was not a quick activity, it was a social institution. You arrived, exercised in the gymnasium, worked through a sequence of increasingly hot rooms, sweated in the caldarium, then shocked yourself back to alertness in the cold plunge pool. The whole process took hours. Along the way, you ran into neighbors, business contacts, political allies, enemies you had to pretend to like. Deals were negotiated in the hot rooms. Gossip about the emperor circulated in the changing areas. Entry cost almost nothing, a fraction of a coin, which meant the baths were genuinely democratic. Slaves, merchants, craftsmen, and senators all used the same water. All of it fed by those aqueducts. The same engineering that carried mountain water 69 kilometers into the city also heated these massive complexes, filled the pools, and ran the fountains in the courtyards. Romans, in a damp, crowded insula with no running water, could, for almost nothing, spend an afternoon in conditions that most of medieval Europe would never experience. And when life in Rome finally ended, Roman law made one thing absolute: the dead could not remain within the city walls. Burial inside Rome was prohibited, so along every road leaving the city, the dead lined the route: the Via Appia, the Via Flaminia, the Via Ostiensis. Each of Rome's great roads was flanked by tombs, monuments, and mausoleums for kilometers beyond the city gates. Wealthy families built elaborate marble structures visible from the road, designed to ensure that travelers remembered their names long after they were gone. The poor were buried in communal underground tombs called columbaria, where hundreds of cremation urns were stacked in neat rows, small niches carved into the walls, each holding what remained of a life. Romans cremated their dead for centuries, believing fire released the soul. By the later imperial period, inhumation, burial of the intact body, became more common, influenced by Eastern religions and eventually Christianity. But whether burned or buried, the dead always lay outside. The city of the living had no room for them. 1 million people. One city. Rome was the first civilization to answer that question, and the answer they built lasted for centuries. Multi-story apartment housing for 90% of the population. 69 kilometers of stone aqueducts delivering 190,000 cubic meters of fresh water daily. A commercial complex with 150 shops serving 1 million customers. 2 stadiums holding a combined 200,000 spectators. Public baths spanning 11 hectares, open to everyone. Street food infrastructure feeding a city that couldn't cook at home. And roads lined with the dead, because even in death, Rome had rules. Fast forward 2,000 years. The apartment building you live in, same concept as the insula. The stadium in your city, the Coliseum blueprint scaled up. The coffee shop on the corner, the thermopolium modernized. Concrete, still built on Roman chemistry. We upgraded the materials. We improved the engineering. But the fundamental question Rome answered first, how do you make 1 million people live together, is still the question every city on Earth is working from. Rome solved it. We've been building on their answer ever since. Thank you for watching. I'm Andrew from Andrew Restores History. If you want to see more cities reconstructed like this, subscribe and drop a comment below. What should we bring back to life next?